Late October 1994, a gravel road outside Ainsworth, Nebraska. 22-year-old Colt Bracken was chaining a dead International Harvester 656 to the back of his father's flatbed, and half the men at Ed Thackeray's farm sale were watching him do it. The tractor hadn't turned an inch in 11 years. Its tires were flat to the rims, sunk into a decade of fence-a-row weeds. The paint had gone from red to the color of dried blood, and a wasp nest the size of a dinner plate hung under the seat pan. $50, the auctioneer had said, almost apologizing for asking. Nobody bid against him. As the chain went tight and the tractor lurched free of the grass with a sound like tearing paper, Wendell Foss leaned against his truck and laughed loud enough for the whole yard to hear it. Boy's gonna tow home a lawn ornament. Colt didn't answer him. He was looking at something nobody else had bothered to look at, the exhaust stack. It wasn't rusted shut. Somebody, at some point, had capped it clean, the way a man caps an engine he intends to start again someday. That didn't square with 11 years of nothing. If you know what it feels like to see worth in something everybody else has already thrown away, on a farm, in a shop, in your own life, American Farm Stories is built for stories like this one. Subscribe if that's you, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Colt had grown up on 80 acres his family leased outside town, running cattle that never quite paid for themselves and equipment that was older than he was. His father worked nights at the grain co-op to cover what the cattle didn't. There wasn't money for a newer tractor, and there hadn't been for years. What Colt had instead was his grandfather, Colt Bracken, who'd farmed the same ground until his hands gave out, and who'd spent every Saturday of Colt's childhood underneath one machine or another, narrating what he was doing whether Colt asked him to or not. Seized and stuck ain't the same animal, Walt used to say, and most men can't tell the difference, so they scrap good iron over a stuck one every year of their lives. Colt had heard that sentence probably 200 times. He hadn't thought about it in years. Standing in Thackeray's yard, watching Wendell Foss walk away shaking his head, it came back to him whole. He remembered one afternoon in particular, maybe age 14, when Walt had let him condemn a stuck water pump to the scrap pile without checking it first. Walt hadn't argued with him. He'd just pulled it back out of the scrap iron a week later, freed it with 2 cans of penetrating oil and a rubber mallet, and bolted it onto a neighbor's baler, where it ran another 6 seasons. He never said, "I told you so." He didn't need to. Colt had learned more from that pump sitting quietly on the neighbor's baler than from any lecture his grandfather could have given him. A seized engine has rust welded into the cylinder walls, the pistons locked to the bores by corrosion that no amount of penetrating oil will undo. A stuck engine is something else. Fuel varnish gumming the rings, a valve hung open, moisture holding 2 surfaces together without any real corrosion behind it. From the outside, both look exactly the same, an engine that won't turn. Everybody in that sale yard, including Thackeray himself, had decided 11 years ago that the 656 was seized. Nobody had actually tried to turn it over by hand in a long while. They were trusting a diagnosis that was over a decade old, repeated so many times it had become fact. Colt wanted to know which animal he was dealing with. He got the tractor home on the flatbed and left it in the machine shed for 3 days before he touched the engine at all. First he pulled the fuel tank, and what came out told him plenty. A half-gallon of sludge the color and thickness of cold coffee. The varnish left behind when gasoline sits and evaporates for over a decade. The carburetor bowl was worse. He set the parts in a pan of solvent and went to bed without starting anything. On the 4th day, he pulled the valve cover and worked a socket onto the crank pulley by hand. It moved. Not far, not easy, but it moved a quarter turn before it stopped, and when he backed it off and tried again, it moved a little further. That was not what a seized engine did. He spent 2 weeks after work soaking the cylinders with a mix his grandfather used to swear by, walking the crank a few degrees at a time, patient the way you have to be patient with something that isn't going to reward you for rushing it. His father thought he was wasting his evenings. His mother thought he was wasting $50 he didn't have to waste. Wendell Foss, who ran the salvage yard on the county road, made a point of asking him at the feed store how the lawn ornament was coming along. Colt kept walking the crank. By the second week of November, it turned all the way through, smooth enough that he could spin it with one hand on the fan belt. He drained the sludge from the fuel system a second time, rebuilt the carburetor with a kit ordered out of a farm magazine, cleaned the points, and put a new battery on it he couldn't really afford. The first attempt to start it did nothing but crank and cough. The second attempt, on a cold Saturday morning with his breath fogging in the shed, it caught, ran rough for 4 seconds, and died. He stood there a minute with his hands still on the throttle, not saying anything. His father found him like that an hour later. "Maybe Foss is right," he said, not unkindly. "Maybe you got the fuel system sorted and the rest of it's still junk." Colt didn't think so, but he didn't have proof either. Just the memory of a crank that turned too easily to have been rusted solid, and a cap on an exhaust stack that somebody had put there on purpose. He went back out that evening and pulled the plugs one at a time, cranking the engine and checking each cylinder's compression against the others. 3 of them read close to even, the 4th read low, and when he pulled that plug, it was fouled black and wet in a way the others weren't. A stuck exhaust valve, not seated all the way, letting compression bleed off every stroke. He worked the rocker arm by hand, freed it, and squirted oil down the valve stem until it moved freely under its own spring. Sunday morning, with his grandfather standing in the shed doorway because Colt had asked him to come watch, the 656 started on the second try and settled into an idle that smoothed out as the oil worked through it. Walt didn't say much. He just nodded once, the way he used to when Colt got something right on the first real try, and said, "Told you." Getting an engine to run and getting a tractor to work were 2 different problems, and the second one showed up 2 days later, when Colt tried to raise the 3-point hitch and nothing happened. The hydraulic pump turned, he could hear it, but the lift arms sat dead on the ground no matter how far he pushed the lever. He pulled the pump housing apart on the shop floor, and found the cause almost immediately. A relief valve stuck wide open by the same decade of varnish that had fouled everything else, dumping all the pressure straight back to the reservoir instead of letting it build. He cleaned it, reseated the spring, flushed the hydraulic lines twice, and refilled the system with fluid that actually looked like fluid instead of tar. The lift arms came up on the first try, slow and a little jerky, then smooth. Word travels fast in a county that small. By the following weekend, 3 different men had found excuses to drive past the Bracken place slower than the road required. One of them was Dale Osborne, who bought and sold used farm equipment across 4 counties and had a reputation for not wasting time on anything that wouldn't turn a profit. Osborne didn't come to buy. He came to look. The way a man looks at something he's heard about and doesn't quite believe. "Heard you got Thackeray's dead farmel running," he said, standing at a careful distance from the tractor like it might still surprise him. "International," Colt said. 656. Heard it was scrap. Heard wrong. Osborne walked around it once, crouched by the rear axle, checked the exhaust note with his head tilted, and left without offering a number. That was, Colt would learn later, exactly what Osborne did with something he wasn't ready to commit to yet. Snow came early that year, and the shed got cold enough that Colt worked most evenings in a coat with a space heater running by his feet, breath fogging over the parts washer. Winter work gave Colt his real proof. He hitched the 656 to a hay rake and worked 12 acres of second-cutting alfalfa with it, then borrowed a loaded gooseneck trailer from a neighbor and pulled it up the grade behind the Thackeray place, the same grade Ed Thackeray himself said the tractor had never handled well even when it was new. It handled it fine. The hydraulics held under load. The engine didn't overheat, didn't lose oil pressure, didn't do anything but run. That should have settled things. It didn't, because 2 weeks before Christmas, his father's hours at the co-op got cut, and the 80 acres they leased needed $140 in fence wire the family didn't have sitting around. Colt had a tractor that ran. He also had a stack of bills that didn't care whether it ran or not. He decided to sell it at the county consignment auction in January, the same sale where Osborne bought half his inventory. The auction yard on sale day was a field of iron. Combines, balers, 3 other tractors in various states of repair, men in canvas coats walking rows with clipboards and coffee going cold in their hands. Colt's 656 sat in row 4, cleaned up but not painted, the dents and the sun-bleached hood left exactly as they were. He hadn't wanted to dress it up as something it wasn't. Osborne found it before the bidding started. He spent longer with that tractor than with anything else in the row, checking the exhaust cap Colt had never removed, thumbing the tread wear on all four tires, dropping to one knee to sight down the front axle for any bend in the housing. He climbed up, worked the hitch lever a few times, listened to the pump cycle, and only then ran a hand along a weld on the rear axle housing that Colt hadn't even noticed until Osborne pointed at it. "Somebody reinforced this mount before it ever sat idle," Osborne said. "Factory didn't do that. That's an owner who cared what happened to this tractor." "Thackeray's father, probably," Colt said. "Thackeray never touched a wrench in his life." Osborne crouched at the rear wheel, checked the hub casting number against something in a small notebook he carried, and was quiet for a moment. Most 656s that sit dead this long end up parted out. Somebody drops the engine, sells the hydraulics separate, scraps the rest, because nobody bothers figuring out what's actually wrong with them. A whole runner with matching numbers and no cannibalized parts. That's the part that doesn't come around often. Not because the tractor's rare, because somebody left it alone long enough for a person like you to get to it first. He looked up at Colt. "You didn't fix a tractor, son. You fixed the tractor everybody quit on." The bidding, when it started, moved slower than Colt expected, and then all at once. A dealer from 2 counties over opened it low, testing. Osborne came in above him without hesitating. A third bidder Colt didn't recognize pushed it further, and for a few minutes, the auctioneer's chant was the only sound in that part of the yard, while the three of them traded numbers back and forth. Colt stood with his father near the fence and didn't say a word. It closed at $4,800 to Osborne. Wendell Foss was in the crowd. Colt saw him, and Foss saw the number go up on the board, and neither of them said anything to the other. There wasn't really anything left to say. Osborne shook Colt's hand after the sale and asked, before anything else, whether he had time to look at 2 more tractors sitting behind Osborne's lot that nobody had been able to diagnose. Colt said he did. That conversation turned into a standing arrangement by spring, Osborne bringing him anything he couldn't figure out fast enough to sell, Colt working through them in the same machine shed where the 656 had sat for 3 silent days before he'd touched a wrench to it. Wendell Foss brought him a dead Massey Ferguson in March. He didn't apologize for the lawn ornament comment. He just asked if Colt had time to look at it, and Colt said he did, the same way he'd said it to Osborne. His grandfather still came out most Saturdays, older now, hands worse than they'd been, but he sat in a lawn chair by the shed door and told Colt what he was hearing before Colt heard it himself half the time. Seized and stuck ain't the same animal. Colt didn't need him to say it anymore, but he liked hearing it anyway. The 656 still works Osborne's home place today, on 160 acres 2 farms over from where it sat dead for 11 years. Nobody laughs at it now. Nobody laughs at Colt either, though it took most people in that county a season or 2 to stop expecting him to fail before they started calling him first. What that tractor taught him wasn't really about engines. It was that most of what gets thrown away hasn't actually died. It's just been misread by somebody who quit looking too soon. And that the only real difference between junk and value, most days, is whether anybody's still willing to turn the crank one more time.